Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be unto God, the Lord of the worlds. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alihi at-tayyibin. And salutations and blessings be upon Muhammad and his family, the goodly. I want to take this opportunity to respond to this extremely ignorant gentleman, Mr. Douglas Duane Dietrich, who has had a falling out recently with our brother Salman Sheikh. I've taken upon myself to plow through his 11-hour ignorant verbiage because I think that, some of the issues that he brings up are very much symptomatic of the general misinformation and disinformation that is coming out of the conspiracy or the con-spirituality culture of YouTube, which YouTube cultivates. Now, as Salman and Brother Matt and others have recently been disclosing, this guy is just basically in it for money, and it's obvious that he's running a scam. But what got me to respond and make this short podcast is that this individual is very deliberately misrepresenting Sufism as a tradition. And this misrepresentation, in the way that he is crafting it, in the way that he's characterizing the tradition, cannot but basically feed the narratives of fundamentalist Islamists. He is trying to craft Sufism, the tradition of Tasawwuf, as a sort of satanic infiltration or imposition within general Islam. Without not really knowing all that much about it, he deigns to pontificate even on the text of the Quran. He tries to, comment on one verse of the Quran. This is verse 25, 29. This is from where he claims that this is indicative of the Cthulhu figure of Lovecraft, etc. And I really cannot hold back, after hearing this nonsense. He is taking the verse 25-29. لَقَدْ أَزَلَّنِي عَنِ الذِّكْبَادَ إِذَا جَاءَي وَكَانَ الشَّيْطَانُ لِلْإِنسَانِ خَذُولًا. Right? The translation, the English translation by Pickthall, is the following. He verily led me astray from the reminder that after he had reached me, Satan was ever man's deserted in the hour of need. Now, because of the way that Arabic grammar works, and because of the actual etymology and masdar or root of this word that ends up as khadulan at the end of this ayah, at the end of this verse, Mr. Duane is taking this indicative as somehow that the nature of the Cthulhu has or the Cthulhu itself, the Cthulhu figure in the writings of Mr. Lovecraft has an echo within the Quran itself. Well, this word, Khadula, is actually a verbal permutation of the root of the word Khadala. Khadala means to desert or to take or to obviate, that sort of thing. Because of the structure of Arabic grammar and because of the way that this word occurs at the end of the verse, right? That is why it appears as the word khadula. Right? لَقَدْ أَزَلْنَنِي أَنِ الذِّكْ بَعْدَ إِذَا جَاءَنِي وَكَانَ الشَّيْطَانُ لِلْإِنسَانِ خَذُولًا. He verily led me astray, the devil, from the reminder. After it had reached me, Satan is ever man's deserter in the hour of need. Right? But khadulan is an actual, this word is a verbal permutation. The root of the word is khalala. Khadal lam, right? So much for Mr. Duane's tafsir, right? Where he's trying to make these completely ridiculous associations between the words and his pseudo commentary on H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, information that I actually even mentioned to Salman Sheikh at the time when he was doing these podcasts with Mr. Dietrich, that this is stuff that much of the stuff that he's saying about Lovecraft are things that have already been confirmed in the actual academic scholarship about Mr. Lovecraft. So this is not new information that this individual is laying out before the general public. This is information that has already been known. So there's no bombshell here. But what is alarming and what should be alarming to listeners who are following this creep is that he is basically giving a platform to the narratives of fundamentalists and Islamists, these head-chopping, murderous, radical Islamo-fascists, the people who have been murdering and maiming and brutalizing and oppressing the Sufi orders over the last 150 years since their miserable existence first took root in the Middle East. What this individual is trying to also very incorrectly, with a very erroneous reading of Islamic history, trying to posit is that the Sufis have always been in a state of kind of a separation and looked on with suspicion by the majority of the Muslim community. Now, on the surface, if one reads certain narratives of Islamic history, this may to some degree be true, but it's a lot more complicated than the way that Mr. Dietrich is trying to present it. Number one, the vast majority of Muslims until the modern period, until these puritanical movements such as the Wahhabis and the Salafists took root, until the time around the end of the 17th century of the Common Era, when the figure of Ibn Taymiyyah began to be revived within the Muslim world. In fact, Sufism and the tariqas within the Sufi world were the normative form of Islam, to such an extent that the fuqaha, the jurisconsulates within even the Sunni world, the vast majority of them may have been the doctors of the law, but all of them, to one degree or another, had affiliations with the Sufi orders. This was the case in the Ottoman Empire. It was definitely the case throughout most of North Africa. Iran was the exception, and Iran was the exception mainly from the period of the Safavids, particularly because Iran turned Shiite. And when Iran turned Shiite, it basically, the Safavid state and the Safavid dynasty looked on the Sufi orders as rivals, even though they themselves had been a Sufi order. So that is the complicated situation. But until the modern period, until probably around the late 19th century, Sufism was the normative Islam throughout the Muslim world. And Mr. Dietrich is welcome to delve into the works of Marshall Hodgson, Irad Lapitus, or any number of modern academic historians of Islamic history for validation of this fact. That Sufism was not a sort of an outcast, iconoclastic, at least socially iconoclastic movement. In fact, Sufism, pretty much from the period of the Abbasids onwards, amongst the Sunni majority, became a very normative form of Islamic piety. Now, when Mr. Dietrich attempts to craft this argument of his about the Sufis, it occurs to me, as he is ranting and raving about Freemasonry, a narrative which in itself has a locus in the smearing and the demonization that begins with the Catholic Church and then later taken on by the Protestants. The fact is that when we put Freemasonry aside, right, Sufism has always attempted to craft itself as being the heart of Islamic orthodoxy. Now, whether we agree with this or not, or whether contemporary Salafists and purists agree with this or not, is neither here nor there. But let us look at the praxis of Sufism. What does Sufism hold as its chief primary text? The Quran, right? What does Sufism hold as its primary practice emerging from the Quran? The recitations of the names of God that occur in the Quran. So the book is a centerpiece of the practice of Sufism. So how is it that Mr. Dietrich is reaching these very dubious conclusions by pontificating on a subject that he absolutely knows nothing about, when he is making an absolute fool of himself trying to articulate Arabic when he obviously doesn't know any, deriving associations and juxtapositions and comparisons with words in verses of the Quran that may have a morphic resonance with his whole obsession with Lovecraft, etc., but which are actually on the face of things, prima facie, are actually incidental. How can he, who has not studied even one particular text other than very dubious text that he's citing in his podcast about Sufism, reach these conclusions? He is essentially giving the lie away to these Salafists. He also calls the mosque culture a church. This in itself, in my opinion, is a dead giveaway, because it reveals that this gentleman is coming from a very entrenched white Christian culture, right? Where white Christian Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So Mr. Dietrich, for whatever pretensions he has had in the past of being, Asian, obviously is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, so he's a WASP, obviously. And so his bias against Islam and the way that he's crafting his argument against Sufism is very much evident, because what he's trying to do in this argument, on the one hand, he is trying to reinforce very surreptitiously the dominant narratives of Islamophobia about what Islam is, but without actually coming out and saying so. But he is doing that in a very dubious way, in so much as he is building a straw man out of Sufism. So he is representing Sufism, Tasawwuf, as something of which it is not. He is trying to insert this argument that Sufism is an inverse, right? Is a counter tradition to Islam, even though Sunni orthodoxy, and particularly from the period of the Abbasids onwards, more and more begins to fuse with Sufism in many ways. I mean, even some of the very predominant figures of the Sunni schools of fiqh, of jurisprudence, people like Abu Hanifa or Ibn Hanbal, are noted by many scholars of Islamic history to have had very close affiliations with, what at their time were proto-Sufi orders, or had association with one of the notable figures of Imami Shi'ism, or Shi'ism, such as Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, the sixth Imam of the Shiites, who is hailed and celebrated by all of the Sufi orders as a major figure of their creed. So I don't understand where Mr. Dietrich is getting this information, and I would advise him very clearly to not deign to pontificate on a language and try to provide these dubious commentaries on the Quran when he has absolutely not a smattering of understanding of the Arabic language whatsoever, and is making an absolute fool of himself when he's trying to provide a tafsir of a verse without knowing what the root and etymology of certain of these words that are employed in these verses are all about. Khadulan, right, is not you cannot derive Cthulhu out of this, right? Because this word is a verb, right? And it occurs, and because of the way that the Arabic language operates, and especially the classical form of the Arabic language in the language of the Quran, this is only very incidental that this word has, any kind of a similarity with his concept and obsession with this Cthulhu figure of H.P. Lovecraft, right? Furthermore, whatever issues that he has with Freemasonry, I mean, I'm not a Freemason, so, it's neither here or there for me. Nevertheless, my own study and research over the years has led me to the conclusion that the demonization of Freemasonry is basically a church conspiracy, originating with the Roman Catholic Church, because it has always looked upon Freemasonry as a competitor. Now, a lot of these Christian fundamentalists and all of those who have been influenced by them to some degree or another are constantly harping on this point, that the ultimate goal, the ultimate philosophy of Freemasonry actually ends up as the throne of God being vacant. And it's very hilarious to me that he's actually using, he's exampling the founding fathers of the American Republic were Freemasons, but he's exampling them as deists, and then trying to insert this fundamentalist slur against the founding fathers, that because they were deists, therefore they believe the throne of God is empty. The deist does not think in those terms. This is the thing about a deist, the philosophical deist that looks upon the nature of the divinity as a sort of a clockwork that creates and then basically it emanates all the rules of creation and evolution, and then just basically stands there, and the whole of the universe and the whole of creation and existence work in a clockwork way. Then the whole notion about the throne of God, or the lack thereof, or either the plenitude or the privation of this thing is completely nonsense, right? So this is one of the many neo-Gnostic, capital G, impositions and dubious argumentations that some of this conspirology subculture online that Mr. Dietrich is trying to make a name for himself in are inserting about, the deism. I would suggest this individual, rather than, making these sorts of pronouncements even about philosophical deism, to actually crack open a dictionary of theology or philosophy and then try this number of trying to insert, this vacant throne BS on deists. Whatever. As far as I know, Freemasonry ends, right, where most initiatic crafts begins. So the ultimate truth is of Freemasonry, from my understanding of studying Masonic texts over years, is not that man must ascend to the throne of God in the way that he has it, but rather the ultimate end point of the Masonic initiation is to get man to understand the nature of the God within, right? So where most initiatic practices, whether we're talking about Sufism, whether we're talking about the Tantra, whether we're talking about Taoism, whether we're talking about the various, shamanic traditions, right? Freemasonry ends where most of these initiatic traditions begin. And this is why alchemical symbolism and geometric symbolism is so important, because it is trying to teach people to get to that point. So, this thing that Mr. Dietrich is saying about Freemasonry is neither here nor there. People should take it with modest grains of salt. But I am very alarmed that this individual is slurring and mudslinging against a tradition without knowing a single thing about it or even its practices. What another example? He claims to read this, he presents this book by these individuals he calls Locke and Aldoon. I tried to look for this book online, I couldn't find it. And he uses the concept of tajweed and tafreed. Now, tajweed is actually not a usual terminology within Sufism, because tajweed as a common term is basically the intonation or the recitation of the Quran by chanting. The science, the ilmul tajweed, is the science of recitation of the Quran. The manner, the hymnical way, the chanting manner in which the Quran is chanted in mosque, there's a whole science to it, and this science is called tajweed, how to intone, read, all that kind of stuff. However, tajweed, if we take the word tajweed and bring and derive it from the root of jud, right? Tajweed can also mean to presence something, right? Then he juxtaposes this with the term tajreed. Tajreed is the term meaning, it comes from the root jarada, to strip of something. That tajreed means abstraction, right? Now, it is possible some Sufi text or pseudo-Sufi text that this Mr. Dietrich has read has tried to use these two terms, tajweed and tajreed, as being the two pillars of the praxis of a Sufi. And I find this quite interesting, because if you even take this terminology, tajweed and tajreed, as being the two pillars of Sufi practice, for any Sufi with any depth of practice or within this tradition, they immediately realize, right, that tajreed, abstraction, instances the first phrase of the tahleel, which is the phrase of that there is no God but God. So tajreed, abstraction, denotes la ilaha, there is no God. And tajweed, to presence, would then denote illallah, other than God. So a Sufi who is putting these two practices into operation in a state of khalwa, in a state of meditation, whether in the desert or whatnot, under the supervision of either a sheikh or not one, would actually be trying to build within their own being an understanding and a realization, more than anything else, of the reality of the tahleel, the la ilaha illallah, that there is no God but God. The very first phrase that every Muslim, recites at the beginning of their testimony of belief. So that is what, if he wants to take it that way, this is what tajreed and tajweed would be instancing. And if he has misunderstood the text that he's reading, then he should perhaps go back to it and look at it. But this is not how Mr. Dietrich is representing it, because he is representing the practices of this tradition, which incidentally I will emphasize again, that particular term of tajweed is usually not used in the context of an actual practice. However, because of the nature of the Arabic language, we can actually derive the word presencing from the word tajweed. If we read tajweed from the root jud, right? This is the way the Arabic language works. But the way that this individual is trying to craft and presence and package Sufism to probably an incredibly ignorant white American audience who hasn't read a book in probably a decade, he is basically in a very surreptitious and very crafty and duplicitous way pushing the Islamophobic arguments of some of these crazy Southern Baptists and right-wingers of the Republican Party or otherwise, because he is basically erecting a straw man out of Sufism, trying to make these people, this entire tradition, trying to slur it as a satanic infiltration. He doesn't actually present any evidence to that effect. What exactly is satanic? This claim that the Sufis drop all morals and that they go into the desert and have sex with animals and children. Where is he getting this stuff from? This is not in any of the Sufi texts that I've read. These are accusations that the fundamentalist opponents of Sufism have periodically and episodically brought forth. So these are the sort of accusations that in our modern time an ISIS or Daesh would level against the Sufis. But anyone who actually knows this tradition from the inside, whether we're talking from the Sunni or the Shia angle, knows that immediately this is nonsense. This is not to say that there haven't been Sufis that have either advocated for this sort of thing or have practiced this sort of thing. As a matter of fact, one of the greatest paragons of Sufism, at least that is known to the mind of modern Westerners, is Rumi. And Rumi doesn't hesitate for 1 second to denounce many of the people that he called the mutasawwifun, those who pretend to Sufism, but then use their Sufism as a cover for vice. So here's one of the paragon figures of Sufism who is criticizing this sort of behavior of people. So obviously, this is a false association that Mr. Dietrich is making about the Sufi tradition as a whole. It's not like that, as he is presenting it. I will leave it here, but people need to be very aware that this guy, for whatever reason it is, who's had his falling out with our brother Salman Sheikh, is an extremely ignorant individual, but he's also got an agenda. Also, some of the pontifications that he's making about Alexander Dugin and this guy Aquino and the Temple of Set and all that kind of nonsense. I would like to see the evidence for his claims. I sent him an email last year. He never responded to me. Obviously, he fears me because he knows that I know my stuff and that if he tried this nonsense on me, I would make him look like the buffoon that he is. Mr. Dietrich, I would suggest that since you do not know Arabic and that you have proven yourself to be ignorant of the language, that you at least have the humility to not pontificate on the text of the Quran without having versatility in the intricacies of the philology and the grammar of the language. I will leave that here for now. I just did that because the first hour of this guy's rant so infuriated me, but it became so obvious to me what he's doing that I had no choice but to basically throw a punch his way because this is just not on. He is slurring an entire tradition without knowing the first thing about it, and offering extremely dubious interpretations of Quranic verses. On top of that, making assertions that are completely just nonsense and are provable to be nonsense, and in essence, operating on the discursive modality of building up straw men. And that in itself proves to me that Salman is right, that this individual comes with an agenda and not a very good one, and that it behooves people who are out there who are listening to this fella to at least have the intellectual honesty to double check his assertions, and especially his misassertions about things that he doesn't know, such as the tradition of Sufism. He may have read a couple of books that he picked up at some, second-rate metaphysical bookstore in San Francisco. But this guy knows absolutely nothing about tasawwuf. And it's not, and the question of whether tasawwuf, Mr. Dietrich, whether the word tasawwuf derives from suf or not, wool, or wisdom, Sophia, is an unsettled question. This has not been settled. There are obviously people who agree that it may come from that word. But as it stands, with the Sad, the letter Sad, tasawwuf or Sufism or Sufi stands on its own, irrespective of the debates over the etymology of the word or not. I suggest you actually go pick up a book. Let me recommend to you what you should actually probably go read cover to cover. Please get yourself a copy of Anna Marie Schimmel's The Mystical Dimensions of Islam. You can actually download this book online if you go to Libgen. There are various editions of this book. This book is the most comprehensive study, both historical and philological and doctrinal study on Sufism that has ever been penned in the modern period. And I suggest that you read this book, Anna Marie Schimmel, The Mystical Dimensions of Islam. Start there. Then, if you have any further inquiries, you should probably put them to someone that knows a thing or two about the subject, and there are quite a few Sufi Muslims out there who will be willing to help you out. I have educated you. I believe I have even schooled you, because you do not know what you're talking about, Mr. Dietrich. And I suggest, also for your own sake, that you act a gentleman and basically cease and desist from any further libeling, slandering, or defaming of my brother and murid, Salman Sheikh. As you know, if you believe that us Sufis are neck deep and eyeball deep in the world of magic and sorcery, which I am, and I'm very open about, then I would suggest, my friend, that for your own sake, you just let it go. Just make this water over the duck's back. Let it be. Leave poor Salman alone, and that will be that. But please, if you continue, at least educate yourself, because if you open your mouth again with the kind of nonsense that has been coming out of your mouth on your podcast that you're uploading to YouTube, and slurring an entire tradition like you have been, then I reserve my right to set you straight and embarrass you publicly. And that is the way it is. La hujja ila Ali qabla nabiy.